anatomists and physiologists. This is the first video in our lecture series about the digestive system. Today we're just going to talk about digestive system overview. For this lecture series, what we want to get out of the digestive system is we want to understand those major functions and processes involved with digestive system and digesting and absorbing nutrients. We want to understand that digestive system anatomy to include those major organs and the accessory organs of the digestive system. But we also want to look at the physiology. We want to look at how digestion actually works, including things like how are nutrients actually absorbed. So we'll go through all that in this lecture series. But first, let's talk generally about kind of what kind of stuff is inside of the digestive system. So I'm going to throw some terms at you here because the digestive system goes by many names. So the digestive system it consists of this big long tube, that kind of goes and meanders in between, and then it goes up and over. All of that's a tube. That tube has a special name. It's called the alimentary canal. So alimentary, that word alimentary means to nourish. So that's the nourishment canal. That's kind of nice. It's also called the gastrointestinal tract. Gastrointestinal or GI tract, or the digestive tract. So there's lots of names. It's also called the gut. There's lots of stuff going on there, but it also consists of accessory digestive organs. So I just pointed out this tube here. That tube is all of this stuff. But everything that's not that tube that's in this picture, for example, I see a little yellow pancreas, I see a liver, I see a gallbladder, that kind of stuff, those would be accessory organs. Aside from those accessory organs, like the ones that are down here, is we also have things that you might not think about. They're things that live up here, like the teeth and the tongue, the salivary glands, all of these things work to help either do the breaking down of food or help break down the food. So we'll break this down as we go through this series. In order to actually digest food and absorb its nutrients for use in the body, we need like a bunch of stuff to make this happen. There's a series of steps here, so that's what all of these colorful labels are. It's kind of a stepwise thing where we gradually decrease the size of the foods that we eat. We move it around, we break it a little bit down, and then we finally carry out, after we've done all of that stuff, carry out those chemical processes that allow for digestion and actually absorption to occur. The first thing we need to do is eat the thing, right? That's called ingestion, that process of ingestion. So I'll zoom in here so we can see it. The process of ingestion is just eating the thing. And that food needs to be made smaller. Like, let's say you take a bite, but you just swallowed that bite without chewing it at all. That would not feel good. So we want to chew the foods that we eat. And that starts the process of mechanical breakdown, physically breaking up to make those bits smaller. And this is great because it's smaller, but it's also great because if it's smaller, it has more surface area. And more surface area makes it easier for enzymes to act on that food. So that's kind of nice. And there's several examples here of mechanical breakdown that we'll talk about throughout this lecture series. So then we start to the process of mechanical breakdown after we've ingested, and then we need to move that food down this tube. The process of moving the food down the tube is called propulsion. Propulsion means moving. You gotta move it. So we swallow that food down our food tube. That food tube has a special name. It's called esophagus. That's the tube that your food passes through after you swallow it. This happens by once we swallow that food, it moves by this process called peristalsis. I'll highlight that word because that's an important word that we'll keep coming back to. I'll highlight it in yellow. So peristalsis is the process of how we like kind of propel foodstuffs through our GI tract, through our food tubes of the body. And there's a voluntary component to this, right? Because when we ingest our food and when we swallow it, we know that we're doing that. But once that food enters the esophagus, we kind of lose track of it. We don't have control over the movement of that food anymore, and that's when peristalsis comes in. Peristalsis kind of reminds me of like if you've ever seen a baker use an icing bag to squeeze the icing out of that icing bag when they're decorating cakes. It's like this top to bottom contraction, and it keeps going as the baker needs to grab on again to that icing bag and squeeze. And it's because this tube is a tube that has muscle in the walls, and so those muscles kind of squeeze, just like a baker might squeeze their icing bag. So that's kind of how food moves through the digestive system. Part of the process of peristalsis is also adding a little bit of mixing into the food once it's ingested, which also aids in the digestion process. And then once we're actually doing the digestion stuff, digestion is the actual process of enzymes. It's like a chemical thing where we're acting on those food particles and breaking them up from food particles into actual chemical building blocks. And once we chemically break it up, then we have to, so from digestion is chemical breakup with enzymes, break with enzymes and stuff. And then that process of digestion leads us to absorption. How do we get the nutrients from the food we just ate and digest it into the blood or into the lymph vessels or whatever? So the process of absorption is like getting it into the body tissues. And then anything that we can't absorb that we did digest, it becomes waste. And that happens largely in this large intestine. And then we excrete that waste as feces. And that is just the waste then leaving the body. So notice here that when we break up this food tube, it's one long thing, starts with we're open to the outside here and we're open to the outside here. So technically this is one long tube that's like not inside the body. We're passing through inside the body, but this tube is technically all open to the outside. So those are the general processes of like how we digest and absorb and all of the things. We'll come back to a lot of these through the rest of the lectures in these series. So this picture is what I mean by that process of peristalsis. So peristalsis is what we're talking about in this picture. And this is how food moves through the GI tract. And remember I said that the GI tract, it's a long tube with muscles in the walls. And when that muscle contracts, then that food can move. And that's what we see here. So when that muscle contracts, that muscle is getting tighter and that's pushing this little bubble of food. We're contracting, that's pushing this bubble of food. And we're pushing and contracting, and that's pushing this bubble of food. The other thing that can happen is that when food doesn't move quite exactly forward, it's kind of like, do you see how there's a little brown bubble here? But then some of that brown bubble goes backwards and some of it goes forwards. Yeah, but then eventually it'll mix together so everything is light brown. There's a light brown and a dark brown, but then they all end up making this kind of medium brown color. And that process of mixing That is called segmentation. Segmentation, we'll come back to that word too. I kind of think of it as like the food is kind of sloshing back and forth a little bit due to how those muscles are contracting. And when we mix the food, it's beneficial because it helps everything become more uniform, which is more helpful for digestion and also smaller. So everything's getting easier to digest. So we know what the digestive organs generally are. Um, But we also need to talk about where are they? Where are they? So the digestive organs are located in the abdominopelvic cavity. So abdominopelvic cavity, which is below the diaphragm, and they mostly live like anterior. So kind of right below your what we would call our stomach, like out in the world. That's where our digestive organs mostly live. And we all of the digestive organs are covered with this serous membrane called peritoneum. And remember that a serous membrane consists of a visceral layer and a parietal layer. So, of course, there's a visceral peritoneum, and that's what attaches to the organ. And then there's a parietal peritoneum, which attaches to the body wall. That helps secure these organs in position. But then, of course, in the middle, because it's a serous membrane, we have that serous fluid. And serous fluid in the middle works to decrease friction, isolate infections if infections happen to go on, and that kind of thing. So serous membranes are super cool. We have the visceral layer, we would call the visceral peritoneum, the parietal peritoneum, or that serous fluid there in the middle. But that peritoneum oftentimes doubles over. So when that peritoneum doubles over, it becomes this double layered thing, this double layered serous membrane, and it gets a special name. It gets called mesentery. So we've talked about mesenteric stuff a lot so far this semester. They said, hold on, we'll talk about it later. It's later. The mesentery, it's just folded over serous membrane. And mesentery, it usually sits more dorsal ish. It usually sits a little bit more dorsal, so attaches those organs to the back part of the abdominal wall. We do have some ventral mesenteries too, and sometimes the mesenteries can get special names. Sometimes special names. Because we have mesenteries of the stomach, for example, and they're called omentum. But we'll talk about it. If digestive organs are contained in the peritoneal serous membrane, so if they're surrounded by peritoneum and or mesentery, which still is peritoneum, we would call those organs intraperitoneal or peritoneal organs. So you might have heard that word before. Oh, that organ is peritoneal. But if that organ doesn't have peritoneum or mesentery by extension, then we would call that organ retroperitoneal. So I'll write that word down. Retroperitoneal. That word retroperitoneal means that an organ lacks peritoneum, serous membrane. So this is an example of this would be like the pancreas, the first part of the small intestine, which we'll chat about. So we would consider those organs retroperitoneal because they just don't have peritoneum on them. So more about peritoneum. This is what I was talking about. So let me get my highlighter out here. I'll highlight in yellow. So what we're looking at is we have this kind of orangish layer here. So we have the parietal peritoneum. Parietal means attached to the body wall. And then we have the visceral one that's attached to the organ. That's this part here. And then that peritoneal cavity, that's where the serous fluid is. Serous fluid inside. So we know that the parietal peritoneum, that's the body wall, the visceral peritoneum, that's attached to the organ, and then the peritoneal cavity, that's where the serous fluid is. And here's what I mean. So when we have the mesenteries, it's just a doubled over thing. So we have two layers of peritoneum. We have a dorsal mesentery. Dorsal means on the dorsal side, and then we also have a ventral mesentery, which is more on the belly side. And then lastly, the last word that I want to show you here is that word retroperitoneal, because it's referring to that this organ here doesn't have mesentery on the back side, so we call it retroperitoneal. It doesn't have peritoneal serous membrane there on the back. The title of this slide is The Basic Structure of the Alimentary Canal, which means that the hole from mouth to anus is one long tube. That's the alimentary canal. Generally, there's four major structures going on here. There's four major layers of that tube. There's four major layers of that tube. First, I want to draw it more simplified, and then we'll talk about like all of these details and stuff here. Okay, so first let's draw just a circle to represent cross-section of our tube. So make that pretty big so we can talk about it. I didn't want that to fill my shape. So there's our circle. So the outermost layer is one layer, and then we have, there's my innermost layer. So we have another innermost layer. So I formed my innermost layer there. One. And then one more. Okay, so here's all my layers. And I'll color code these as we go. So my innermost layer, I'll color in pink. And that way I can color code on our image too. Our innermost layer is called the mucosa. Our innermost layer is called the mucosa. The mucosa is the innermost layer, so then the inside of most organs, linings and coverings are epithelium, and that's exactly what we see in the mucosa. So that's the mucosa. And then there's other things there, but we'll chat about it when we get there. The next layer is called the submucosa. So that's the next layer, submucosa. So I'll color this one blue. And then in our picture, we'll highlight all those things in blue. So this layer is called the submucosa. The submucosa is just a bunch of connective tissue, and there's lots and lots of elastic fibers in there. So the submucosa is pretty stretchy. Then I'll use yellow. The yellow layer that I'm about to draw is a muscular layer. So this yellow layer is a bunch of muscle. So we call this the muscularis externa. Or you could call it just muscularis if you want. So muscularis refers to there's muscle, and externa means it's closer to the outsides. And then the last outermost layer is, let's see, I'll do it in green. So that outermost layer is called the serosa. Serosa. The outermost layer is called the serosa because it's the same as the visceral peritoneum. It's the same thing. So the serosa, it's a part of a serous membrane. So let's label our picture then here. So the mucosa, that's that inner epithelial layer, and that's this one here, mucosa. So note here that mucosa consists of epithelium, and sometimes that epithelium also secretes mucus. The digestive system has lots of parts of it that secrete mucus, and that's because digestive enzymes are super hard on those tissues. Like on the tissues inside of here, those digestive enzymes try to eat them away just like they try to digest our own stuff. So that mucus is a very protective thing. And there's also like digestive enzymes in there, hormones in there, that kind of thing. The cool thing about the mucosa is that's where we do absorbing. We absorb the digestive stuff. But it also protects. So the mucosa is where we absorb, but it's also where we can get a little bit of protection. And that protection comes from that little bit of immune function that we have there. We're going to try to inhibit the growth or proliferation of pathogens. And look at this mucosa. It consists of three major layers, right? So we have that epithelium, so we talked about that. And it's usually simple columnar epithelium. Simple column. Simple referring to one layer of cells, columnar meaning those cells look like columns. Unless you're in something like the mouth, the esophagus, the anus, where there's lots and lots of friction. So sometimes that epithelium is simple columnar. Other times it can be something like stratified squamous, so many, many layers of squished cells. And that's really beneficial for protection. So that's where we'd find stratified squamous epithelium in the mouth, in the esophagus, and the anus. But regardless, we'd still call it the mucosa, part of the mucosa. There's also a layer called lamina propria. The lamina propria, or the propria rather, is a bunch of loose connective tissue. So that loose connective tissue helps stick to the next layer, but there's also some lymphoid follicles there that have immune function. We eat lots of germs, we need to get rid of them. So it's nice to have some lymphoid follicles there. And then lastly, we do have a little bit of muscle in the mucosa. It's called muscularis mucosae, mucosal muscle. And that's smooth muscle because we don't have conscious control over this for moving the lining around, and that helps with absorption, secretion, that kind of thing. But the real muscle layer is the external one, which we'll talk about in just a sec. So that's the mucosa. And note that the mucosa is directly open to the lumen. The lumen is that middle part. So everything that's hollow there, this hollow part, that hollow part, that's called the lumen. Okay, so then next is the submucosa, which is blue. So the submucosa, that's the next layer. That's this next layer here. So there's lots of fibers, lots of blood vessels, lots of lymphatic vessels. The thing about submucosa is that there's lots of elastic fibers, and that gives it quite a bit of stretchiness. So lots of elastic fibers, which make it very stretchy. And if it's stretchy, that's good because we want that that tube to expand and then contract right back. And that big muscle layer, I'll highlight in yellow, that big muscle layer is called muscularis externa. The muscularis externa has two layers of muscle. There's a circular layer and a longitudinal layer. What that means is that one layer of muscle goes around this tube, like a circle. That's the circular layer. And the other layer of muscle, those fibers are longitudinal. So in one way, we're contracting around, and in the other way, we're contracting forwards and backwards. The circular layer, the longitudinal layer. So regardless, that helps with propulsion of that food through that canal. And then the last thing is the green layer, which is called the serosa. The serosa is a bunch of connective tissue that's the same as the visceral peritoneum. So we have after this serosa, we would expect to find that serous fluid of the peritoneum. The thing is that if you are the esophagus, so in esophagus, that serosa has a special name. It's called the adventitia. The adventitia is just like dense connective tissue that just sticks that that esophagus to the other structures in the thoracic cavity. Because the esophagus, that's the one in the thoracic cavity, everything else, abdominal pelvic mostly. So generally, we can expect these 4 layers in our whole tube. So we're always going to be thinking about that when we go to talk about all of our little tubes here. So the purpose of this lecture is to overview the nerve or the digestive system. So I want to bring this up because the nervous system and the gut, like this seems interesting because we would think that the central nervous system is like just I'll tell you what to do with digestion and stuff. But there's actually a whole system. It's called the enteric nervous system. The enteric nervous system. And it consists of a bunch of enteric neurons. And its whole goal is to regulate GI activity. So it contains enteric neurons. And its goal is to regulate GI activity. So all of the digestive system is innervated by these enteric nerves, and a lot of it operates on reflexes. We have short-term reflexes, which is when the enteric nervous system responds to GI activity, and this results in things like segmentation, peristalsis. So short-term reflexes can be something like segmentation, peristalsis. But there's also long reflexes. They get a little bit more complicated because they're longer term reflexes. Long-term reflexes. And this is because we send that information up the line to the CNS. And then what comes out of that is that we usually get ANS, autonomic nervous system impulses that either regulate or down-regulate the activity of the digestive system. And just to recall, if we have a lot of PSNS input, that leads to lots of GI activity. If there's lots of SNS input, we're going to really suppress that GI activity as a rule. But of course, this is a balancing act and it's not a light switch. So we aren't ever all PSNS dominated or SNS dominated. So everything's a spectrum. So that enteric nervous system helps regulate all of those things. But then that begs the question, right? How does the digestive system actually work? And there's three major steps here. First, there's this idea that something has to be detected. And that word detected means that we're looking for a stimulus. That stimulus can be either mechanical or chemical. And that gives us information about if there's food there or not. And that's detected by stretch, how stretched or not stretched those muscles are in that tube. What solutes are present. So we have stretch, we have solutes, we have like pH, we can monitor that, or any other chemicals that may be present. There's going to be things that are detected. So once we have that receptor detect, um, then smooth muscles and glands, they're the workhorse of the digestive system, really. Those receptors, once they're stimulated, these receptors, once they're stimulated, they'll activate those smooth muscles. They'll activate those glands to start mixing and moving along with the smooth muscle, for glands to release digestive juices, mucus, that kind of thing. And then lastly, the nervous system, the neurons, they call the shots because they're controlling digestive activity. But it's because this is by reflexes, like with those short-term and long-term reflexes. But also there's hormones that are released too, by things like the stomach, the small intestine. And those hormones also help affect secretion, contraction of muscle, that kind of thing. And so this is an overview lecture, so we'll discuss more in this lecture series and in the lab as we talk more about like the specific organs, how they work, each organ's specific mechanism of action, and its contributions to the overall whole of the digestive system. But that's all I have for this video, so I'll see you in the next one.